There are doors that close behind you, and there are doors you walk through on your own terms even when someone else is the one holding them open. This is the story of Camille Ashworth. And the morning she learned exactly which kind of door she was standing in front of, the Ashworth estate sat on 11 acres outside Richmond, Virginia, a stone manor that had belonged to Camille's father's family for 3 generations. Ivy climbed the western wall in a pattern that had taken decades to establish itself so completely. Boxwood hedges were trimmed into careful geometric shapes by a groundskeeping staff that had worked the property since before Camille was born. It was the kind of house that photographed beautifully and had, for the past 2 years, felt almost nothing like home. Camille was 18 years old, standing at the front gate on a Tuesday morning in early autumn, a single packed bag at her feet. Beside her stood a man named Elijah Cross, mid-30s, dressed plainly in a worn field jacket, a duffel bag of his own slung over one shoulder. He had arrived at the estate 3 days earlier, on what Patrice Ashworth had assumed, based entirely on his unpolished appearance and the modest sedan he had arrived in, to be some kind of handyman or courier sent by an attorney's office to deliver paperwork. She had not asked his name. She had not asked why he was there. She had simply told the staff to let him use the guest cottage for the night. The way you extend the bare minimum of courtesy to someone whose presence is inconvenient, but not worth questioning further. Now, 3 days later, with the entire household assembled on the front steps of Patrice, 2 of her sisters, Camille's step-cousins, and several members of the household staff who had been summoned for what Patrice had described as a family matter. Patrice stood at the top of the stone steps and looked down at Camille and Elijah standing together at the gate. She said, "Go on. I'm sure wherever he's sleeping is better than the attitude I've had to put up with under this roof." She said it the way you say something you intend as a dismissal dressed up as a joke, the corner of her mouth lifting slightly, already half-turned to gauge whether her sisters found it as satisfying as she did. Camille did not argue. She had stopped arguing 2 years earlier, somewhere in the long, accumulating weight of small cruelties that had followed her father's death, the sharp comments about her place in a house that had never quite felt like home, the casual reminders that she was tolerated rather than wanted, the slow erosion of whatever warmth had once existed between her and the woman her father had married 4 years before he passed. She picked up her bag. Inside it, wrapped carefully in a sweater, was her late mother's leather-bound journal, the one thing Camille had managed to keep hidden from Patrice's periodic clearing out of anything she deemed unnecessary clutter. Tucked beneath a loose floorboard in her childhood bedroom for the better part of 2 years. She had checked, that morning, that it was still there before she packed anything else. She reached out and took Elijah's hand. They walked through the gate together, past the assembled family, none of whom said a word. Camille's father, Theodore Ashworth, had built a logistics and shipping company into one of the largest privately held operations on the East Coast before passing away from a sudden heart attack when Camille was 16. He had remarried Patrice 4 years before his death, a decision he had made, Camille believed, out of genuine loneliness after Camille's mother passed away when Camille was 11, and a hope that his daughter might have a stable home with 2 parents in it again. In the will Theodore left behind a document Patrice had read in full and had, Camille would later learn, deliberately misrepresented to the rest of the family in the years since. He had structured Camille's inheritance with unusual care. The estate, the company shares, the trust accounts, all of it was to remain under the oversight of an independent trustee until Camille turned 25, specifically to protect her from exactly the kind of pressure and manipulation that a grieving 16-year-old, suddenly without her father, might otherwise face from the adults left around her. Patrice received a generous monthly allowance from the estate for housing and raising Camille. She had never bothered to learn the name of the trustee overseeing the arrangement. Beyond a vague awareness that someone from the law firm handled it, she had certainly never bothered to consider that the man who had spent 3 quiet days at her guest cottage, conducting what he described only as a routine review of the household, might be that very person. Elijah Cross had been appointed trustee of the Ashworth estate by Theodore himself, 18 months before his death, after a business relationship that had grown into something closer to genuine friendship. Theodore had trusted Elijah specifically because Elijah did not perform wealth the way most people in Theodore's circles did. He dressed plainly. He drove an unremarkable car. He had built his own modest but respected financial advisory practice on the principle that the people who needed protecting were rarely impressed by appearances. And the people doing the protecting shouldn't be either. He had come to the Ashworth estate that week to conduct an unannounced, informal assessment of Camille's living situation, something the trust documents permitted him to do periodically, and something he had been quietly planning for months. After a brief and guarded phone call from Camille herself 2 months earlier, she had said very little directly in that call. She had asked, almost in passing, whether the trustee ever actually checked on how things were going at the house, or whether that was just something written into the paperwork that nobody followed up on. Elijah had heard enough in the careful way she asked the question to decide it was time to see things for himself. Patrice had spent 3 days walking past him in the hallway without a second glance. She had not asked what he was doing with his time at the estate. She had assumed, as she assumed about most people she did not consider socially relevant, that his presence required no further thought from her. As Camille and Elijah walked down the long gravel drive away from the house, Eleanor Voss, the estate's longtime manager, who had worked for the Ashworth family for over 20 years and had watched Camille grow up from a small girl trailing after her father through the gardens, stood quietly to the side of the front steps. She had said nothing during the exchange. It was not her place to intervene in family matters, and she understood, with the particular clarity of someone who has spent 2 decades watching a family's dynamics shift and curdle, that intervening in the moment would only make things worse for Camille. But she had her phone in her apron pocket. As Camille and Elijah reached the gate, Eleanor quietly raised it and took a single photograph. The family assembled on the steps, arms crossed, expressions cold. Camille and Elijah walking away together, hand in hand, neither one looking back. She did not know exactly why she felt the need to capture it. She simply understood, the way she had come to understand a great many things about this family over the years, that it would matter eventually. Partway down the drive, Camille spoke for the first time since leaving the house. She said, quietly, "I didn't argue, because I had already learned that the house was never going to be mine no matter how politely I asked. So I left like someone who already knew where she was going." Elijah did not respond right away. He simply nodded, the way you nod at something you understand completely and do not need to comment further on. He had heard, in the careful, contained way she said it, the same quality he had noticed in their phone call 2 months earlier. A young woman who had learned to speak with great precision about things that had hurt her for a long time. They reached the iron gate at the edge of the property. Elijah stopped. He turned back toward the house, where Patrice and the rest of the family still stood on the steps, watching. He raised his voice, just enough to carry across the distance. He said, "You should know who you just sent away." He paused. He said, "My name is Elijah Cross. I'm the trustee of this entire estate the company shares. The trust accounts, the property you're standing on right now. As of this morning, that includes the monthly allowance this household has been receiving for the past 2 years." The silence that followed was the particular kind that arrives when a room full of people simultaneously begin recalculating everything they believe to be true. Patrice's expression moved through confusion, then disbelief, then something closer to panic as the pieces assembled themselves of the man she had assigned to the guest cottage without a second thought. The 3 days he had spent quietly observing the household, the joke she had just made in front of her own sisters and the household staff about where he might be sleeping. She said, there must be some mistake. The trustee's office never said. Elijah said, "I don't typically introduce myself with my title when I'm trying to understand how a household actually operates, rather than how it performs for outsiders. I find people are far more themselves when they think no one important is watching." He looked at Patrice for a moment longer. He did not raise his voice further. He did not need to. He said, "I've seen enough." He turned, took Camille's hand again, and they walked through the gate. The trustee's formal review, conducted over the following weeks, was thorough. It documented the pattern Elijah had personally observed during his 3 days at the estate, and it was corroborated through interviews with household staff who had remained quietly loyal to Camille's memory of her father's staff, who had watched the same pattern of treatment unfold for 2 years and had never had a for him to say so until someone finally asked out the monthly allowance to Patrice was suspended pending a full accounting review of how estate funds had actually been used over the previous 2 years. Camille's residence was formally transferred, under the trust's emergency provisions, to a private arrangement overseen directly by Elijah's office, with Camille given full input into where and how she wanted to live for the remainder of her status under the trust's protective terms that, given her actual age, applied for a far shorter window than Patrice had ever bothered to understand. Since the original concern had simply been ensuring Camille was safe and supported until she could fully come into her own, Patrice's standing within the small social circle that had once orbited the Ashworth name eroded quickly once word began to spread, not through any deliberate effort on Camille's part, but through the simple and glamorous mechanism of people noticing when a family's financial circumstances change and asking why. Camille moved into a modest apartment near the university she had been accepted to the previous spree. An acceptance Patrice had actively discouraged her from pursuing, telling her at the time that it was an unnecessary expense for someone who already had everything she needed. She enrolled that fall. She kept her mother's journal on the small shelf beside her bed, the leather cover worn soft from years of careful handling. And in the evenings, when the apartment was quiet, she sometimes opened it and read a few pages. The way you visit something that has always been safe. Eleanor Voss left the Ashworth Estates employment for months later, citing a desire to spend more time with her own grown children. She kept the photograph from that Tuesday morning saved in a folder on her phone, alongside several other photographs of Camille over the years, as a child running through the garden, as a teenager at her father's funeral, and now this one. Walking away from everything that had tried to diminish her, she added it quietly. The way you add something to a collection you are keeping for someone else. For whenever they are ready to see the full shape of what they survived, she walked free.